Hello and welcome to Knitting 101 Techniques Untangled, where we're looking at 8 key skills to help improve your confidence as a knitter. Today we're going to tackle swatching. It's something that we all know we should be doing but often skip. By the end of this video, I hope to convince you to swatch for every project. So we're going to cover 2 topics. Firstly, why we swatch, and secondly, how to swatch effectively. But before we get to that, what is a swatch? It is a small square of test knitting and it serves 2 key functions. The first one is to test your gauge, which is also referred to as tension, and this will ensure that your finished item is the correct size. And the second reason to swatch is to get a feel for the fabric you're creating and making sure that you like how it looks and feels. So here we have our swatch. So in order to knit a swatch, the first thing you need to do is look at the gauge or tension stated in your pattern. So for this pattern, it states that you need 22 stitches and 30 rows over 10 centimeters or 4 inches, and that's the standard way of writing it in a pattern. It's best to double check this though, because sometimes they give the gauge or tension over 1 inch, so that's just something to bear in mind and read carefully. So what we did here is, in order to have enough of a swatch to measure, you need to knit a slightly bigger square than those numbers stated. And the other thing I would suggest doing is this border, just so that the swatch sits flat once you come to count it. So I would recommend adding 8 stitches and 8 rows to the given gauge. So what we did here is cast on 30 stitches and then knit 38 rows. And that gives you a big enough area to measure. And that will give you the border. The middle section is stockinette or whatever your pattern suggests. So it might say to do it in a rib or often a stockinette. Okay, so now you're going to need your tape measure and you're going to place that on your swatch. And I normally start by counting the stitches. As I said, this is the more important measurement. So you can see we're up to 10 centimeters here. So we're going to count how many stitches are in that middle section. So, and they're in V's if you can see. So that is 1 stitch, 2, 3, 4. So the stitches are in pairs for the V's like that. So that is 1 stitch. 5, 6, 7, 8. 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22. So we've got 22 stitches across, which is correct. That is the gauge we were looking for. And then what you do is repeat that process by placing the tape measure top to bottom, doing that again over the 10 centimeters, and you count in the same way. So each V in one, try and pick out a column of stitches, make sure it's straight, and then pick out the V's, and that is your row count. So I won't count the whole row, but I'll just start off so you can see what I'm doing. So here you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And you'd repeat that up till you got to 10 centimeters, and that would be your row count. So one thing I forgot to mention there was it really helps to use something to point at the stitches as you're counting, just so you can see where you are. So this is a cable needle from Coco Knits, nice bamboo one. You can also use a double pointed needle, just anything that allows you to pick out the stitches as you're counting. So now that you've got your row count and your stitch count, you need to see if it matches up to your pattern. So we ended up with 22 stitches and 30 rows, and that is correct. That is the gauge I was after. And if that's the case, then you would carry on with that size needle. However, if I had ended up with too many stitches and too many rows, so my swatch was too big, then I would go down a needle size, and I would repeat this process. I would knit a new swatch, and I would then count those stitches, and they should be then either nearer or hopefully the correct gauge. On the flip side, if you don't have enough stitches and you don't have enough rows, that means your swatch is going to be too small, and you're going to need to go up a needle size. And once again, repeat the process and hope that that time you get gauge. And you keep going through this until you end up with the right number of stitches and rows. As I said before, it's far more important to get your stitch count correct. And if you imagine that this is a jumper, this measurement across that you're knitting is going to be the how your jumper fits round you, so round your arms, round your bust, and that is the measurement that's really important that it fits. Your row count is more linked to the length of your jumper or your sleeves, and that is something you can adjust for much more easily when you're knitting. So if you end up with too many stitches going across, you're going to get a baggy jumper, and if you have too few, it's going to be really tight and stretched when you try it on, which is not what you want, and you can avoid that by getting the right needle size at the beginning. So another thing to bear in mind is that most gauges given in patterns are based on your swatch being blocked. If it doesn't need you to block the swatch, it should state that, but you should assume that you need to block it. And if you don't know what blocking is, we have another video on that, so I'd recommend you go and watch that next. The other reason to wash or block your sample is if your design has something like this colour work and you're using two very contrasting colours, it's a great opportunity to check that the darker colour doesn't bleed when washed, because you can imagine if you'd knit the whole jumper and then you wash it and this bled, you'd be really gutted. So it's great to just test out the dye fastness right at the beginning. So if you are substituting yarn in your pattern, so you're not using the yarn suggested and you've picked something slightly different, it is doubly important to swatch, and these two swatches here prove that perfectly. So these were both knit on 4mm needles, and they are both double knit yarns. However, you can see the size difference in how the finished swatches have come out, and that is can be due to a lot of different factors, such as the fibre, the way the yarn has been spun, and also the needles you're using. So that doesn't mean you can't use these yarns, you just will have to play around with the needle size a bit more and make sure that you get gauge at the swatch stage so that your finished item turns out the correct size. So the final reason to swatch that I mentioned earlier was to get a feel for the fabric you're making. So these are both knit in the same yarn. This is Issachar Spinny, and you can see that they've turned out quite differently because of the different stitch patterns used. This one's a lot drapier and this one's got a lot more structure to it. So that's just something to bear in mind and to look out for when you're swatching. Is your yarn choice giving you the stitch definition and the drape that you require for your project? And if not, then you might want to think about trying out a different yarn and saving that one for something else. So hopefully I have convinced you to start your next project with a swatch. There are loads of other videos in the Knitting 101 series, so do go and have a look. I would recommend checking out the one on blocking, as it follows on nicely to what we've looked at today. Otherwise, thank you for watching and happy knitting.